pillow angels, and quality of life. Over the last few weeks, we have practiced, especially during discussions, we have been practicing parts of this philosophical pattern of inquiry that was introduced during week 1, week 2 of this course, as well as we have seen the proposals for who or what we might morally and ethically answer to. It could be groups, it could be, groups of people, it could be a divine being, it could be wholly and solely just to ourselves. And we've also seen two of the more significant ethical or moral theories, consequentialism and deontology. We've assembled together all of these things throughout these few weeks. And now we're in a position to use what we've learned and become familiar and have become familiar with over these weeks to directly consider a case, an ethical or moral case. The case we're going to consider is the Ashley case. And as one will have found when they read through the material in this week's module, it's about a little girl and her parents and some doctors and an ethics committee. That all of those individuals were involved in the outcomes of this case. In terms of the facts, what are the facts of the case? Sometimes, we hear that phrase, I just want the facts of the case. Well, the notion of facts can be a little, wish-washy, where one person would say something is a fact, whereas someone else may not think it's a fact. That's typically in cases where we're not being clear about what's being assumed. And what I have done is just tried to purge the assumptions out of these descriptions so that they should just be the information that anybody involved in the case would agree on. So the first one is that Ashley was born with significant mental and physical impairments. By the age of 6, she was totally dependent on tube feeding for nutrition purposes, as well as she was not able to sit up, not able to stand up, not able to walk, has minimal control over her arms or hands. That's the idea of being non-ambulatory, not able to move, to locomote in any controlled fashion. As well as she was not able to use language. She does seem to be aware of her parents, the doctors, but it's an awareness in the sense of being able to look at them but not necessarily maintain eye contact. So it's a little iffy if there's, say, direct recognition. That may or may not be the case. And that goes back to that there are these various mental cognitive impairments. Her mental abilities were likened, in some cases you'll see them described as those of an infant, with the same level of awareness, engagement as an infant. And then in other cases you'll see mentioned sometimes that maybe her development was up to about a 2-year-old mentally. And keep in mind, this was at the age of 6. So there's definitely a different development in Ashley than there would have been in a typical 6-year-old. And her parents at the age of 6 and before, but by the age of 6, her parents had become concerned that Ashley was becoming larger. She was growing bodily, becoming bigger, and she was showing the first signs of puberty. The very first signs. And this was concerning to her parents because as she became larger, the concern was, well, how are we going to be able to move her, to turn her, to include her in all these family activities and various things? Because she could not include herself. It will be a case of the parents always having to locate her wherever they want her to be at any given time. She will not be able to autonomously make those decisions or perform those actions herself. And they were concerned about that as well as her overall safety and her health, like long-term safety, like a sort of concern that maybe someone might try to physically take advantage of her sometime in the future. The parents had quite a few concerns, and everyone will read about those concerns throughout this week, especially when they read this document, which is the Ashley treatment towards a better quality of life for pillow angels. That's by Ashley's parents. And in this document, this pillow angels is a phrase that they came up with, or that they at least apply to Ashley. It's in reference to that she'll be small and the size to be able to put on a pillow or a bean bag, a larger pillow. But in this document, this is the parents' concerns expressed by the parents. This is their words for their concerns. And everyone will read those and see about them. I'm just giving a sort of brief, condensed, concentrated version of the facts. And it does seem like it is a fact that they had various concerns. Dykema, that's one of Ashley's doctors that the parents consulted with the aid of various medical specialists, like various pediatric specialists, and an ethics committee. The parents went to Dykema and others about possible medical interventions, like what could they do medically to Ashley in an effort to alleviate some of their concerns as parents. And that the Dykema, as well as the other specialists and the committee, that everyone supposedly agreed there was a consensus about a particular sort of intervention strategy or treatment strategy. That strategy would involve removing Ashley's breast buds, performing a hysterectomy, as well as a 2.5-year regime of high-dose estrogen injections. Those were the three big aspects to this. There is, as would there absolutely be, there'd be various post-op procedures, various post-operative drugs that would have had to have been applied. Anyone familiar with medicine would know that there's quite a bit of other sorts of pharmaceuticals and rehabilitation. There's quite a bit of stuff that had to be involved in achieving these three big things. So that's just something to keep in mind. As the results of this treatment strategy is that Ashley's overall length, given that she doesn't necessarily stand up, she's always in a reclined or a sitting position, but her height is what this would be equivalent to if she were to stand up, and her weight were likely attenuated, meaning that her height, she did not become as tall as she would have otherwise became, and nor did she increase in weight and mass as much as she would have otherwise increased in mass had she not received this high-dose estrogen injections for 2.5 years. And you can read in the articles, the Dykema and others, the doctors, they describe how they think this sort of growth attenuation therapy, how it works. Essentially, it closes the growth plates and it halts growth. Like think about it when we talk about with our children, they have growth spurts. Like they're kind of small, and then it's at a certain point of age, they start to gain in height and gain in mass and weight. They become, bigger. They become more adult sized. Well, these high-dose estrogen injections, the idea is that by doing that with Ashley, it halted that process of her enlarging in size. And so that is a likely result. They do not know with certainty whether that is absolutely true, because there's been research on this sort of theory on doing this with young girls and young boys but more with young girls. But it it's not there's no 100% in this, that it's likely that she did decrease, that she may would have increased like another 5 to 6 or 7 inches in height, as well as she would have absolutely put on more weight as time continued. Also, one of the results is that she'll never experience like the menstruation cycle, never have a period, never be able to be pregnant, and that she won't have to worry about breast cancer, cervical cancer, nor have any discomfort associated with having developed larger breasts. All those things, like any sort of thing that's associated with breast bud removal, hysterectomy, or these estrogen injections, anything that any physiological response that could occur due to these or outcome due to these, that's what the results of it will be. And you can read more about that in the articles. Soon after reporting and promoting, we'll see that when we look at some of the articles, of what the parents refer to as the Ashley treatment, which that's just referred to this bundle of medical procedures or interventions that after they were performed, both the parents, the doctors, and the ethics committee, they were publicly challenged regarding the morality, immorality, or the ethical, unethical nature of their decisions and actions. There were quite a few people. The news media picked up on it, as well as just lots of people, disability rights advocacy groups. They heard about it, read about it, and then were immediately suspicious about, did these parents, doctors, the committee, did they make a moral decision, or were these treatments in some way unethical or immoral? There was a significant, and still to this day, a significant amount of question regarding whether this was an okay thing to do morally. Via various interviews and an online blog. There's a link to the parents' blog in this week's voluntary module where everyone can read about it. They can read much, much more about the parents' thought process and reasoning. That the parents offered their reasons for their decisions. And the core of them appear inside this document, the Ashley treatment towards a better quality of life for Pillow Angels. You can get a summary. There's pictures of Ashley at age 6. That was Ashley. As you read this, there is in here a page. It's going to be vertical given the way I have it viewed, but in your window you can rotate it. But this summary page, it's on page 5. A person can look through that, and it gives like the big layout of what the parents were thinking, their reasoning, their justifications, and it's on page 5 of this in this document. Everyone, I encourage you to look through that, carefully read it. And that was the way the parents put this sort of article, this Ashley treatment article, up there quickly, like 2000, and the treatment occurred as she was age 6 in 2007. They posted this. They started this blog, perhaps even a little earlier than that. But it was not long after it that they received so much public concern and disapproval. Some people agreed. Some people were totally supportive. But there was a significant amount of public outcry, is what one might say. And so the parents, they started an online blog, and they posted their reasoning, their thought process, their pictures, various things. As well as in 2006, the doctor, the one you always encounter regarding this case, is Dykema, and there's actually a video in this week's module where you can see Dykema and hear him, hear his words as he's asked questions, various things in an interview. But Dykema and these other doctors, Gunther and Faust, they actually created articles in the various, in various respected medical journals, science journals, and they promoted this treatment as a potentially good intervention, a good way to, a good medical, an ethical and medical way to intervene and to assist parents who choose that once they know the risk, if they choose this particular regime of treatment, that they advocated for it. They promoted it, not only defending that it was an ethical option, but as well as it's like a beneficial option, that it would enhance the person's or the child's quality of life. And it was in their best interest to do things that like were done in the context of this Ashley treatment, but only on a case-by-case basis. They never said every little child that is in a similar situation to Ashley should receive this rounds of treatment. But they do promote that it might be a good idea, an option to consider. And they did that in the journals. And that went over not so well, as one might expect, that if there was already sort of ethical concern, well, the reality that the Dykema and the others kind of promoted this as a reasonable therapeutic option, people were not convinced. And now, since the time of this, like this, the situation with Ashley and these articles, that there are still news articles within the last year or 2 years that still talk about this case. The ethical, moral standing of it is still far from decided, but there have been quite a few other parents with children in similar situations as Ashley that have opted for this. So there has been some people that have, said, yeah, this is a good idea too, and they have, their children have gone through a similar treatment regime as Ashley did. So in many ways, the Ashley treatment set a precedent that others have now followed. That's just something to keep in mind, is it was new and not something that was being done. And then after Ashley's parents and the Dykema and the other doctors, after they did this and promoted it, it set a precedent that, oh yeah, this might be an okay thing to do, so other people have decided to do it as well. That is the current facts of the case. There's other things, and they show up in the articles. You'll absolutely be able to see all of it, but I'm just giving the sort of big picture facts. Now, with these sort of facts in hand, what we can do is we can apply this pattern of philosophical inquiry we could apply it to any individual argument that has been made in this case. This pattern, it works for any sort of argumentation you'll find in the context of an ethical moral case. What I'm going to do is apply it to like just a big picture version of this case so that everyone can see how it works and how it's useful in making sense of what's going on the big scale, so that everyone has a sense of what's actually going on in this case, what was a big argument that's still in play, and kind of we'll just work through it and see what our results are. The problem. Remember that in the philosophical pattern of inquiry, the problem is really why were the articles ever written? Why did the parents, the doctors, feel the need to throw all these words at us? When you approach an article or a book or a paragraph, whatever it is, with this philosophical pattern of inquiry, when you're looking for the problem, in our case, you could approach it in a slightly different way, but in our case, when you're thinking about the problem, you're thinking about the problem that motivated the writer, the author. Why did the author feel the need to write the words they did that we are now reading or listening to? What was their agenda? What was their motivation? And as I've said before, sometimes we can't always find the problem up front, but in this case, it's a really nice one. That's why it's picked for us to look at, because the problem is understandable. Namely, that the parents and the doctors and the ethics committee, they made a decision and they performed some actions. Then those actions and that decision became public knowledge. It's in the public domain. And then there's a significant public outcry saying, whoa, y'all did something morally bad, morally wrong. That's what a certain percentage of people that read it think. Not everybody, but a percentage of people who encounter this case are immediately kind of put off by it. That it's like, this is not so good. That's the sort of thing that some people have. That's their reaction, whether it's a knee-jerk reaction instantly, they hear about it and they're like, whoa, this is bad. Or it can be something that's developed over time as they read more and more about it. It's like a growing sense of unease that there's maybe something morally suspect or ethically suspect that happened. This doesn't happen with everybody, but it does happen with quite a bit of people, as we'll see. As you read about this case throughout the material in this week. So the problem, as far as we're going to understand it in the big picture way, is that they wanted to defend themselves. They wanted to say, we did nothing wrong. They wanted people to think that, yeah, this was okay what we did. We did it and had good reasons to do it. So their motivation is defensive. Their motivation is to say, hey, we didn't do anything wrong. They don't want people to think they messed up morally. And that makes sense, especially if you're the doctors or the ethics committee, because licensing is based on things like this. Like if doctors or medical personnel or ethics committees that are sitting on the board of hospitals, if their integrity and their morality is questioned, well, that can have a significant impact on their lives. They could lose their licensing. They could lose their certification. So there's a big investment in not being publicly perceived as immoral or unethical. There's an extreme motivation not to defend oneself in a case like this. And so that was the problem, and that's the reason for why did they write so much? Why did Ashley's parents create a blog? Why did the doctors go the trouble to publish about this in various journals? Is one of the problems they were trying to alleviate was we need to defend ourselves. People are saying we did something wrong, and we don't want them to think that, so we'll defend. So the problem is how to defend ourselves. The question that is being answers are being provided for this question throughout all the articles we will read by the parents and the doctors, is that the question is, did we act immorally or unethically? Was it wrong to remove Ashley's breast buds, perform a hysterectomy, subject her to high-dose estrogen injections or therapy for 2.5 years? That's the big question. It's like this is just a more specific version of this more general question. So was it morally wrong to do this to Ashley? To do these 3 big things? That's the question that all of their comments are in some way attempting to answer. Their answers is to be expected given they're in a defensive position and their motivation is to defend themselves. Well, how do they answer? Did we do something wrong? Well, no, they're going to say, no, we did nothing wrong. Our decisions and actions were moral or ethical. That's their conclusion. That's their major claim, that across everything you read, that's what's always in some way attempting to be supported with reasons and evidence and examples. And that's what everything they say is directed towards saying. Now, there is an aspect of the doctors are trying to promote this treatment as a good idea, but under that, they are only trying to promote it because they think it's ethical and moral, that it was totally ethically okay to do this. So they'll always, everything that's said is always going to be that underlying claim is no, we did nothing wrong. We did perfectly fine. Now there are reasons. This is the like big picture reason. The doctors give a lot of reasons. The parents give a lot of reasons, but they can all be condensed on and looking at it from just at arm's length. Everything in terms of a reason can be condensed and shoved under this notion of why did we do nothing wrong? Well, because our decisions and actions were moral. Well, okay, our decisions and actions were moral because they enhanced Ashley's quality of life. That's the big reason. That's a big one. And it shows up in the Gunther Dykema, the 2006, which everybody has access to. It shows up in Ashley's parents, and it shows up in the 2010. Just so everybody can see that, so Ashley's parents is on page 3. So here's page 1 of the Ashley's parents thing. There's page 2. Okay, page 3. Where exactly is it? Well, it's right here. Faced with Ashley's medical reality as deeply loving parents, we worked with our doctors to do all we could to provide Ashley with the best possible quality of life. The result is the Ashley treatment. That is your overall reason right there. That best possible quality of life. So why did we do what we do? Because we wanted to provide Ashley with the best quality of life. That's also the reason why they did nothing wrong to their mind. That is the core reason that shows up in everything that's said about this by the parents and the doctors. You'll find mention of quality of life or mentions of it was in Ashley's best interest. Those phrases essentially mean the same thing in the context of the reasoning provided. So the best possible quality of life, or an enhancement to her quality of life, or within her or in her best interest. Every one of those things is directed toward that main reason. Why did we do nothing wrong? Because we were just trying to enhance her quality of life, and in fact we did. That's kind of the way it's going with their reasoning. It also shows up, like we can find the example of it in Dykema, Gunther and Dykema, 2006. It's on page 1016. So let's see if we can find that, page 1016, so that everybody can see it. Notice that the reason is not always stuck right out front. Sometimes we have to go hunt for it. Yeah, on the Gunther and Dykema article, under this heading of the ethical debate, we can find it down here. Let's see, it should be around here somewhere. Yeah, it should be right in here. Let's see if I can find it. Does it offer these things, the primary benefit? Yeah, right here. There is a reasonable expectation of improved quality of life. Right there. That is the main overarching reason in play from a big picture point of view. There is a reasonable expectation of improved quality of life for a non-ambulatory child with profound developmental disabilities. It's showing up in the middle of a question style. The question here then is whether there's a reasonable expectation of improved quality of life. Well, all these other words are going to try to support, yep, there was a reasonable expectation of an improved quality of life. And you can see that over here where it says right here, there does not appear to be a conflict between the interests of the parents. Yeah, there it is. Seems mutually beneficial to caretakers and patients. Right there. That is where they raise the question about quality of life, then they answer it right there. So what they did, the way the doctors are approaching this, is to say, well, it would be perfectly ethically okay if it increases her quality of life, and if it enhances her quality of life. And then they say, oh, and it seems that that's in fact exactly what it did. This is inside. It's on page 1016 of Gunther and Dykema. This article. The next indication of it's this 2010 response to critics, page 33. So we should be able to find that. Let's see. Yep, that's right here. Page 13 or page 30. And where would it be here? It should be, let's see, page 33. We need to get to page 33, and it will be down here somewhere in this area. And let's see if we can find it. Yeah, right there. And that's the explicit. The motive in offering these interventions was always to improve her quality of life. Remember last week when we were talking about deontologists, the motive for what a person does, that matters a lot to deontology people. Like, why did someone do what they did? If they did it in order to respect someone, or to enhance the situation of respect for someone, is supposedly perfectly morally okay. Well, right here you have Dykema and Faust, two of the doctors, that they claim our motive was always, doing any of these things, was always to improve our quality of life. They had good intentions or goodwill, if we're thinking in Kantian terms. And so this is the core reason of why did we do nothing morally wrong? Because we were motivated to enhance our quality of life, and in fact we did. That's your core overarching reason. Now, can we make an argument for them just based off of knowing that that's the main reason? Sure we can. And this is the sort of small initial shot at it. Remember, in this argument section of this pattern of inquiry, all we're trying to do is just to pull out the major pieces we need to assemble a charitable argument. At this point, we don't have the full-blown argument, but we can get the superstructure, the overall argument of their defense for why they did nothing wrong. Is you can say, well, the first reason could be something like, it's always morally okay to enhance another being or person's quality of life. That seems reasonable. That would be, this is how we get the ethics and morality into it, is that it's always morally okay to do something. Well, all we did is do that thing that it's morally okay to do. Therefore, our decisions, actions were morally okay. That's the structure. It's a typical structure that you see all the time throughout ethical argumentation, is that you'll have one of the reasons. In order for it to be an ethical or moral argument, it has to include some mention of morality. So that's what this first reason does. It says it's morally okay. That's the assumption that the parents, the doctors, everybody's making when they give this justification. When you say that an action was good because it did something, well, then the implication is that doing that something is in fact good. Think about that. That is how you make an argument ethical or moral, is you say, yeah, it's morally okay to do X. Well, we just did X, so what we did has to be morally okay. And that's the exact structure of this sort of small version of the argumentation, is it's always morally okay to enhance another being's quality of life. Our decisions and actions enhanced Ashley's quality of life. She's a being. She's a person. A human being, if not a person. She's a being. And thus, our decisions or actions were moral or immoral. This would be their overall, driver argument throughout all of these articles. And so, now we need to become clear, though. At this point, It's easy to say an argument, but it's never so easy to understand it, especially in a particular case, especially when we're dealing with professionals in some field. In this case, I'm going to focus on the doctor's argumentation. That means that's different than if we were to focus on the parent's argumentation. The doctors are medical professionals, meaning that their standard of evidence, the way they have to support, like they have to establish that their decisions and actions actually enhanced Ashley's quality of life. That's what they have to establish above all else. The parents would probably have more burden on them to try to establish this first reason, because they're not held to the same standards, because they're not medical professionals, they're not scientists, they're just parents. So by focusing on the doctor's argumentation, we need a certain sort of evidence that, namely, we need evidence that their decisions and actions actually enhanced Ashley's quality of life. That's what we got to have. So when we're trying to understand this sort of argument that parents and doctors alike are both offering, it's going to be understood in a different way for the doctors than it would be for the parents. I encourage people, after watching this video, to go and try to assemble a charitable rendition of the parents' argumentation. But in this video, I'm just going to focus on the doctor's argumentation, because I think there's a lot that we can learn by doing that. It's not, to pick on the doctors or anything like that. It's just a matter of that in the context of ethical moral cases, it's always important to be very clear about who is the author. What is that author's expertise? What is that person obligated, given their expertise, to provide us, the reader, with, the people who are actually considering their argumentation? What would be good support for their claims? What would be less than good support for their claims? So we have to understand quite a bit about medical decision making in order to actually eventually analyze this argument. Remember, in this understanding phase of this pattern of inquiry, all we're trying to do is assemble a charitable argument for, in this case, the doctors. We're not trying to judge or criticize or critique the argument. We may notice things as we go along, we surely will, that may be a little questionable, but the purpose of this understanding phase is to develop a charitable rendition, in our own words, of the argumentation. We start with a sort of small generic pattern of argument, just to figure it out. Like the pattern, if one wants it, is it's morally okay to do X. The doctor's decisions and actions did X. Therefore, their decisions and actions were ethical or moral. And that's the generic argumentative pattern. You always want to find that, if you can, in this fifth stage. But now we need to actually enhance this to make it a charitable argument. Well, the first thing to notice is that first reason. It's always morally okay to enhance another being's quality of life. Well, that needs qualification. In order to be a decent reason, it's not decent as it stands. Namely, it wouldn't be morally okay to enhance, it would not always be morally okay to enhance the quality of life of someone if, in order to enhance the quality of life of, say, Bob, I have to severely diminish the quality of life of, like, Sally and Bill and Ted and Marcus and all these people. That's just something to notice right up front, that this argument as it stands is not good enough. It will not take anybody who used it to the finish line. It would not get them here, because this reason could absolutely be false unless it's qualified. It needs more than just the words that are there. Namely, it needs a qualification to the effect that it's always okay to enhance a being's quality of life as long as we don't diminish the quality of life of any other beings in the process. We need that. And so we'll give it to them. We'll give it to them in order to be charitable. We're not losing anything by giving it to them. We're trying to assemble a plausible argument for the doctors. And so it's always morally okay to enhance another being's quality of life. And then we can qualify it with something like, as long as no one else's quality of life is diminished in the process. That is, no other being is harmed, maimed, etc. during our efforts to enhance the quality of life of this other one. So the idea is, in the case of Ashley, is the doctors would want to say it's always morally okay to enhance the quality of life of, say, Ashley, as long as we don't diminish the quality of life of other people involved in this situation during our efforts to enhance Ashley's quality of life. And also, we can be really generous to the doctors and give them something that it seems especially morally okay to enhance the quality of life of a person or any kind of being that's already has the cards stacked against them. Like some might say is the case with Ashley, that her overall quality of life it may appear at least to be quite a bit less than someone else's. Like, Ashley will not be able to engage in certain projects that a lot of people would consider to be especially meaningful, like to be able to go to college, to be able to, own her own business, to have a profession, to do a lot of things. It's like the overall quality of her life might be quite limited in comparison to just an average person that does not have Ashley's particular cognitive and physical impairments. And so if we want to be really generous to them or be really charitable, what we can do is give them, an edge, a sort of argumentative edge, and say, yeah, it seems especially morally good if you're trying to help a person that's already at a significant potential disadvantage. And that's exactly what the doctors, when you read through their stuff, they emphasize this, that Ashley already was at a smaller, limited quality of life, and all we've done is try to enhance that. So that's supposed to garner a little more morality, a little more ethical quality to their behavior. So, keep in mind, with ethics and morality, it's almost always about somebody being harmed or injured, that somebody's well-being is at stake. And so it seems all the more moral and ethical if not only did you try to prevent someone from being harmed, but they were already highly vulnerable to harm. And you did something to help pull them up above that harm, higher than they were before. That gives a little more moral oomph, as one might say, to their reasoning. So we'll give that to them. And then we can redo, like reason one can be expanded. That's why I put these little stars here, or these little asterisk marks, is we could give them for reasons. We can give them all three of these. It's always morally okay to enhance another being's quality of life if and when doing so does not diminish the quality of life of others involved in the situation, especially if and when the individual that's being helped already endures and likely will forever endure a lower than normal quality of life. And then efforts to enhance Ashley's quality of life did not diminish the quality of life of others. In fact, they may have enhanced the quality of life of her parents. The doctors say that too, so let's give it to them. The next thing is Ashley already endured and likely will forever endure a lower than normal quality of life. So that just ties back to, see, we did something really, really morally good, because not only did we enhance her quality of life without hurting anybody else's, we actually, by enhancing hers, we may have also enhanced the parents' quality of life, and Ashley was already at a severe disadvantage, and we were just trying to help her be at not quite as severe a disadvantage. This makes a much more stronger case than just that first reason up here by itself. This is the way you do a charitable rendition of someone's argument, is you give them what they were trying to give themselves. Like the doctors say all of these things. And we're just trying to capture a little bit more of what they actually said and what their intent and what their reasoning seems to be. And we're giving them what they need in order to make the best possible argument they could make. Now, that is just from a philosophical or ethical point of view about what's needed to get this first reason into a more defensible position. Now we can look at this second reason. Our decisions and actions actually did. This would be statement of fact, declarative statement. That this is the one that the doctors really need to have support for. It is crucially important. I mean, I don't see anything wrong with giving them whatever they need to establish this sort of moral principle that it's always okay to try to enhance someone's quality of life. That seems plausible as long as we qualify it, that we didn't hurt anybody else in the process, and that maybe even more so if we're dealing with someone that's already at a disadvantage. That doesn't seem argumentatively problematic at all, and it makes reason one seem plausible. Absolutely seems fine from both philosophical and what an ethicist would be willing to grant the doctors. That second reason, though, that's the one that everything turns on, was Ashley's quality of life actually enhanced? Why think that it was? That's what we need. We need to give them some support for that. In order to do that, though, we have to understand quite a bit about medical decision making. Not a tremendous amount more, but we do likely, everyone in this class may not be as familiar with these notions, especially not the notion of like risk-benefit analysis, which is what the doctors claim was done by themselves, the specialist, and the ethics committee. That is their efforts to support the idea that they actually enhanced Ashley's quality of life through these interventions. And so we need to understand not only how medical risk-benefit analysis tends to work, we need some sense of it. There's no way in a class like this that we can get the full picture of it. It's just there's a lot involved in it, tremendous amount involved in it. And there's always lots of people involved in it too. But in this case, we just need the basic understanding of how a medical risk-benefit analysis is supposed to work and what is actually meant by quality of life. Like, I've been just flinging that notion around up to this point in the video. I've not explained what that actually means. And so it would seem extremely pertinent that we need to actually know what it is that was supposedly enhanced in order to be able to evaluate this argument, to say, is this a good argument? Even with the qualifications we've added to that first reason, we still have to make sense of what is being said in the second reason. Thank you, Microsoft. And that we still need to understand what it means in this medical scientific context to make a claim about enhancing something. That something is quality of life, so we need to understand what quality of life is, as well as what would it mean to enhance it, or how do you make a determination and assess whether you did that or not. We need both pieces, benefit-risk analysis as well as quality of life, before we can strengthen this second reason. So let's do that. Risk-benefit or benefit-risk analysis. Our question is, what does this empirically mean? Our decisions and actions enhanced Ashley's quality of life. So what does it empirically, scientifically, medically mean? What does that mean? Well, the first thing is benefit-risk analysis. Many people will already be familiar with the kind of idea of we weigh the pros, we weigh the cons, and then if the pros outweigh the cons, then maybe it's a good thing to do. That's the basic idea. That's not mysterious or magical. We do this all the time. We've already encountered a version of benefit-risk analysis It's called consequentialism. When it's applied to ethics and morality, this is a version of consequentialism. This is when we say, oh, yeah, the benefits for the most people outweigh the risk to the most people, then it's morally okay to do the action. That's a way to reinterpret consequentialism. I mentioned when we were talking about consequentialism that it shows up everywhere. Well, the doctors, in their defense, the way they will try to defend the second reason is going to be a version of consequentialist argument, but it's going to be targeted toward Ashley and maybe her parents and the future caretakers of her. That's going to be their majority. So one could rephrase their defense in saying that we enhanced Ashley's quality of life because we achieved the best results for the most people involved in this decision. That's one way to reinterpret their defense. So it's a sort of consequentialist style reasoning. It's not, pure consequentialism, but it is consequentialist. And that's kind of what is always involved in benefit risk analysis, is you're looking at projected outcomes in comparison to the risk. So how does that work? Well, in order to do it, like you do an actual mathematical calculation, you can do this in a lot of ways mathematically. Typically, though, it comes down to something like this. This is a super simplified version of it, but it's good enough to give us a feel for what had to have happened in order for the doctors or any medical personnel to say, yeah, this decision or intervention enhances this person's quality of life. Well, the first thing with like estimated risk, estimated benefits and risk, what we do mathematically is we take the estimated benefits, you multiply that by your probability, the likelihood of actually achieving those benefits. Then you divide that by the estimated risk or the cost, if we're talking about money, times the probability of incurring those costs. So you do this multiplication in the numerator, you do it in the denominator, then you divide, and you end up with expected value over expected disvalue, and then you end up with what's known as a benefit risk ratio. Well, remember, a ratio is just a fraction. That's all it is, but it's typically with ratios, we like to talk in terms of a sort of phrase, like a 2-to-1 ratio. For every 1 turn in, I get 2 turns out. Or for every 1 turn in, I get 50 turns out. That's how it works, like when you're talking about like gears or pulleys or mechanical systems. That a ratio is just how much of something happens, or the occurrence of how much of one occurrence, what does it result in terms of another thing? And we'll see that as we go through this. But so let's just use an example. That's the easiest way to make sense of doing a benefit risk analysis in this real simplified way. Is say that we have a project. We have something we need funding for. And we want to kind of get an estimate about how much output can I expect given what I put in. Well, the first thing you can do is do an estimate. How much do you expect to earn from this project? Like, think of it in terms of if you're a small business and you're thinking about investing in your business. Well, you need to project how much do I think I'm going to earn based on how much I invest. That's the first part you need. And then you also need the actual likelihood of earning what you estimate you'll earn, as well as the likelihood of spending or incurring the cost you estimate you'll incur. So in this case, say we expect with this project, this thing we want to do for our own business or whatever, that we'd earn at the end of it all, once the project's complete, we'd earn $10,000. How certain are we that we'll earn $10,000? Well, about 75%, like 0.75 probability. So we're 3/4 certain that if we do this project, see it through to completion, make this change in our business, we've got like pretty decent certainty 75%. Remember, it can't be 100% because things can happen, hurricanes, floods, the market can fall out from under our business. Say we're selling high-end luxury cars and we want to do a project to promote our luxury cars. Like, you can think about this as like a marketing campaign. And we expect to earn a certain amount, assuming that certain other things don't happen. Well, based on our historical knowledge of the way the market works, based off of our history of doing other projects in the past, we come up with an estimate of the probability, like that if this project's carried to completion, our estimate with 75% certainty is our likelihood of actually reaching this estimate is $10,000. We think we have a 75% chance of earning $10,000 if we see this project to completion. Then we have to take into account the cost, that in order to do, say, this marketing campaign, we're almost 90% certain that we're going to have to pay at least $2,500. And how do we get that 90% certainty? Is we do estimates. We call marketing agencies. We look at historical data on how much does it normally cost to do a project like this one, and we gather that data together. We do statistics on it. We calculate it. We get the mean, the median, the mode. We do standard deviation, and then we can do some probability scale of how certain are we that our costs are going to land within so many deviations of the average. Now, that terminology, that statistical terminology with standard deviation, you may not be familiar with that. But the essence of it is that we do a lot of math in order to get an estimate. That math is based on historical data. It's based on data we have in our hand. And that's how we develop these levels of certainty in terms of probability. So it's like, it's 75% likely that we'll earn $10,000. It's 90% likely that we're going to have to spend $25,000 in order to get this project to see it through to completion. Well, once we do that, we have the estimated earnings. We multiply it by the likelihood of actually getting those earnings, plus the likelihood we have our estimated cost. We multiply that by the probability of actually having to spend that amount. We divide it. There's the numbers. We divide it, and then we end up with this ratio, this fraction. $3.33 earned over $1 spent. So our ratio is a 3.33 to 1 ratio. So for every dollar spent on this project, making it happen, we could expect with some level of certainty that we'd make $3.33. That's good information to have. That lets us know before we ever get started with this project that this project has a chance of being profitable. And what would the profit be? Well, subtract 1, the dollar invested, from the expected earnings per dollar, and we get $2.33. So for every dollar we expect to make, or we expect to spend, we expect to get $2.33 back. That's pretty, that's pretty good. That's, 200%? 233% better. So it's a pretty decent return. And that's for every dollar. So that means that, and you can see that, looking at 2,500 investment, 10,000 earning, you could subtract 10,000 from you could subtract the 2,500 from the 10,000, and then you'll get, whatever it is, 7,500, and then that'll match this ratio. If you look at it, and why wouldn't it? Because it's going to, there's the division, so you can start from the ratio and calculate back up if you want to. It's a reversible calculation like most are. And so with this project, our expectation is that more will be earned than spent on this project. There is greater benefit to us than there is risk associated with this project. Now, for comparison purposes, suppose that we have another project, another thing we could invest in. We have two options. And so the expected earnings from that project are $35,000. Now the investment's significantly higher. We expect to have to spend $10,000. Well, we look at the project, and then based on historical data, we only really have a 52% chance of incurring that profit. So it's almost like a 50-50 shot here. This is a much more risky project, but it's got a much bigger earning potential too. And then in terms of the cost, say that we are only 45% certain that we'd even have to spend $10,000. We may be able to spend a lot less. You could certainly discover that through historical data analysis. That, yeah, it's in a sense, it's more likely that we won't have to spend as much as we estimate. But we may. There's 45% chance that we might, or probability that we might. And this is all based off of the statistics that have to have taken place behind the scenes. We're just looking at the top level. And I just made these numbers up so we'd have something to look at. But these are totally realistic and real world cases. And so we multiply the estimated earnings by the likelihood that we'd actually achieve those earnings. And then we multiply the estimated cost by the probability of actually having to spend that or incur that cost. We get a fraction, we do the division, and we end up with a 4.04 to 1 ratio. So that means we're looking at getting $4.04 return for every dollar spent on this project versus the 33 to 1 ratio on the first project. So which should we pick? Well, if we compare the two projects, if we use the principle always fund projects with the greatest benefit cost ratio, that it has the potential to earn us the most for the least, for the, a 1 in cost, then we should choose the project the fund should be B. But as people probably noticed, that the accuracy, the legitimacy of saying that we should fund B over A is all wholly and solely dependent on these probabilities, these likelihoods. Like, what is our confidence that this is actually an accurate probability? Like, how confident are we that there's only a 45% chance that we're going to have to spend $10,000? How confident are we in that number? That requires more mathematics. We're not going to do those mathematics, but if you take a statistics probability class in the future or a data analysis class, we'll encounter this notion of confidence intervals, a notion of margins of error, a whole lot of other notions. Statistics is an entire area of mathematics. There's a lot of ways to estimate the accuracy of your estimates and your predictions. And we also, in these probabilities, remember, they're based off of the way the data came out to be. But what if our method of sampling the data was bad? What if we made a mistake and there's bias in our data? Well, that's immediately going to affect the way those probabilities come out. We won't go into all this, but just keep in mind that you need the probabilities in order to do the multiplication to be able to get this ratio, this benefit risk ratio. You need those probabilities. In order to get those probabilities, there's a lot of things that have to go right. The data had to be good. You have to have a lot of it over a significant historical span. The more samples you have from the population, the more accurate you're going to tend to be. And that has to happen. Otherwise, you have very little confidence in these probabilities. These are just shots in the dark, just guesstimates, and not very good guesstimates without a whole lot of good statistics underneath it. So you need that in order to do a good risk-benefit analysis. That's just something, just put that in your mind. Anytime you ever do a risk-benefit analysis, everything turns to be able to get to this point. This is the end result when you get to the ratio. In a sense, we started at the end. how does this begin is doing everything we can to actually get these numbers. And that involves a lot of careful sampling, a lot of careful selection of formulas, like how do we want to process this data? How do we want to do the average? Like everybody's kind of familiar with the notion of averaging numbers. Like you take all your numbers together, you add them all together, and then you divide by the total number. If you have like 10 numbers, you add those 10 numbers together, then you divide by 10. That gives you in statistics what's known as like the basic mean, the mean of the numbers. It's not necessarily the midpoint, but it's close to it. Typically, if it's a normal distribution. But the situation with it, not to get bogged in the statistics, is that there's other ways to do averaging. There's Windsor averaging. There's a lot of different ways to do that, and that's all going to influence like what formulas we use in trying to get to these final numbers. That matters. How we actually got the numbers that we're plugging into the formulas. That matters. Our methodology. How were these numbers collected? How did we try to remove any biases that were in play? How did we do those things? All of those things are going to matter when it comes to being able to get these numbers so we can actually do an end result to get a final ratio of the benefit to risk. Got to know those things. That being said, so that's just any benefit risk analysis has to be aware of those things. That's just the basic facts. That's got to be. Good statistics have to have gone into developing the numbers that you eventually multiply and divide together to get your ratio. Bad numbers in, bad methodology in, means bad ratio out. Meaning bad in this case means your ratio is not anywhere near certain as you might think it is. You just don't know. It could be totally in the weeds as far as accuracy. Where you need to be could be a million miles from where your ratio is saying you actually are. That matters. And that's just a practical reality of any kind of benefit risk analysis. Not necessarily medical, that's financial. If you're dealing with a business, if you're dealing with your own personal life, the ultimate benefit risk ratio is only as good as what is the possibilities you consider and the accuracy with which you assign probabilities to those things. And that's going to be based on how much data, how much research did you actually do, and care did you take in developing those numbers. I've said a lot about that because it really matters in real life, everyday jobs. So now, the benefit risk calculations when we're talking about medical, well, there's ways that it's done in medical. Typically, you'll encounter things if it's like funding projects or particular research interventions, like in the case of the Ashley case. What likely happened is there were these things called dollies and qualies. And we're not going to go into the mathematical details of dolly qualies. We're just going to assume we got a quality score and a disabled score. That's all we're going to do for the purpose of this video. But realize there's math that goes into getting these two scores. There are charts of data that goes into this that we're not talking about. But just as a simple way to think about it is the way medical risk benefit analysis tends to go is there are numbers that have been assigned to a person's typical life expectancy. Like your average person that has no health ailments is projected to live, say, 76 years. And we're familiar with this. We've heard that, like the average life expectancy of male is this, average life expectancy of females is this. Everybody in here will have heard of those things. Well, so that's your kind of mortality. Like your projected, this would be the normal, the average, say 76 years. Well, what happens is when we get a disease or an ailment, an injury, that our mortality rate may decline. Like say that someone's diagnosed with, say, some form of cancer. Well, the projected life expectancy for someone with that cancer starting at the age, say someone was 40, they're originally projected to live to 75. But with this cancer, the projected life expectancy is only 60, given they started at 40, say 20 years. Say it's not a very aggressive form of cancer. Well, that means they will have lost 15 years of life by incurring that burden of disease, that cancer. Well, so now we subtract the 60 from 75. That gives us 15. 75 minus 60 is 15. Well, then there's a morbidity, like the actual burden of cancer itself. And there are charts that have some number associated with that. It'll be some number between 0 and 1. And that has been collected across the globe. That number, that morbidity, is kind of an accurate number. There's a lot of good research and statistics that goes into making a morbidity number. But it's a number. And what ends up happening is there's a multiplication that happens in here, and there's subtraction that happens in here, and then these two things are added together, and you get what's known as a DALY, a disability adjusted life years. And you get that number, and it goes into, it gives you a way to assign one number to a very complicated phenomena that's related to either a lot of people or just a few people or just one person. The quality adjusted life years, the math is similar. There's videos on YouTube. You can look them up. Just look up DALYs and QALYs, and you'll see that there's videos that show you there's many ways to do this calculation. I just talked through one of the typical ways that this stuff's done. But you don't have to know exactly how it's done for the purposes of this class. Just know that it's a whole bunch of statistics. It's a whole bunch of data collection. And in the end of the day, we push it through a formula and get a number. And then we can compare that number. If we have another intervention option or another project, we can compare the two numbers and see which number's higher or lower. If we're doing it through these DALYs, these disability adjusted life years, we want this number to be as small as possible. If we're doing it through quality adjusted life years, we want that number to be the biggest. Namely, if this quality adjusted life years is about the health benefits of a particular procedure. And so the idea is, yeah, you want to have as many health benefits as you can. Whereas these disability adjusted life years, you'd want to have the least of those as you could. That you want the high, you want something to barely impact your life expectancy and have a very, very, very low morbidity score. If this is really low and this is really low, then the whole disability adjusted life years will be really low. A minimal impact on someone's life, or the years they'll live. Whereas this, we want it to be the biggest it can be. We want the most quality life experiences possible, so we want it to have huge health benefits and a huge quality, score. Then you see these in the context of medical interventions, medical project decisions. Hospital administrators do this all the time. Project leaders do this all the time. And there's analogs to these, like in engineering, in any business setting, in any setting where you got multiple options you could pick from. They're going to do a version of benefit risk analysis. And these are just like, here's your risk, here's your benefit. That's kind of the way to think about it. And this is oversimplifying it. I'm not claiming this is perfect, but I am claiming that this is a sense of what goes on behind the scenes. Like, how does a hospital decide it gets a $100 million research grant and it's got like 5 research departments? How does it decide how to allocate that $100 million across those 5 departments? Well, it does DALY QALY calculations, and whichever department their outcomes seem to create the highest quality numbers and the lowest DALY numbers, that's the one that's going to receive the most funding. Why? Because that generates the most benefit for the least amount of risk. It has the lowest benefit, it has the best benefit to risk ratio. Way more benefit comes out than the invested risk. Now, and that being said, here's how it can play out with the doctor. is that the doctors say that you've got your quality score. This is how much the life of the person is going to improve over times however many years it's going to be improved. And this is the burden of a disease or whatever, how much a person's life is going to be hindered or burdened over how many years. And this is just a rendition to make it mirror the benefit burden scenario or benefit risk calculation we saw up there. This is not necessarily the way it would always be performed in an actual practical scenario, but it's good enough just to get a feel for what this does. So say I got a quality score that whatever this medical intervention is, it has a 65% quality score. It's going to improve my life by 65% over a 10-year span. My quality of my life is going to be 65% better over 10 years. That's good. That's not bad. But now, as with all interventions, there's going to be side effects. There's going to be a cost. Like, to give you a real thing to hold on to, say a person is diagnosed with like diabetes. Well, they can take insulin treatments. They can do these various, treatments, take various medications. By doing that, that means their life could be 65% better than it would have been had they done no treatments. But there's side effects to taking certain diabetic drugs. There's side effects, and so that's the burden that we're still going to feel. The drugs aren't going to be 100% perfect. There'll still be days where maybe we get dizzy. There'll still be days when we bump our toe and it doesn't heal as quickly as we might would like. That's the burden that's going to be there. Some of that's just due to the nature of the ailment, but some of it can be a direct side effect of the various intervention treatment that's involved. So this seems realistic, 65% increase in quality versus 35% burden, increase in our burden over 10 years. There is no disease or ailment that comes without some sort of cost or risk. That's all this is saying. And then we can take those two numbers, do the multiplication, division. Well, this intervention A, says that for every one amount of burden, I'm going to get 1.86 benefit out of it. That's good. That means that I'm going to benefit more from this intervention than I'm going to be burdened by it. The intervention is going to generate more benefit for me than risk or burden or cost. For every one burden, I get 1.86 benefit out. That's good. That's a positive in the right direction. You want the number to be higher on the benefit side and lower on the cost side. You always want this number, the benefit number, to be better than the burden number. Well, then we go to intervention B. Say that intervention B will only increase my quality, my benefit by 35% over 35 years. But it's going to increase my burdens. My benefit's going to be 35% over 35 years. My burden's going to be 75% over 35 years. That already doesn't look good. Just thinking about that. Well, then what does it do when we do the math? Whoa, look at that. That is not good. If your benefit number is lower than your burden number, that means that I have more burden after this intervention than benefit. Well, if I just compared these two outright, well, obviously, if I want more benefit, I'd want to go with intervention A. And if it's a doctor making a decision and this is the way the benefit burden calculation comes out, or benefit risk comes out, well, then immediately you should pick option A. That's better for the patient. So if the doctor followed this principle, choose the intervention with the greatest benefit, lowest burden ratio, then option A is a clear winner. But, once again, that but with an exclamation point, we forgot to add in the probabilities of achieving and incurring each one. Once they are included, these ratios could be drastically different. Well, what does that mean? It means that we take these same numbers that we just threw them in here. We said, oh yeah, over 10 years, my quality would increase by 65%. Over 10 years, my burden would increase by 35%. But how sure am I about those numbers? What is the likelihood that these are good estimates? What is the likelihood of actually achieving this 65% benefit over 10 years? What is the probability of achieving a 35% burden in 10 years? Depending on those probabilities, these ratios could come out totally different. Well, let's see. Say that I'm only a doctor based on past research, historical studies, that intervention A, the benefit of it is not completely understood, which is totally realistic in a medical scenario. Medicine is not what's known as an exact science. It's very good, no doubt about it, but it is not 100%, and many times it's a lot more iffy. It could be less than 50%, like in this case, where whatever this intervention is, maybe it's a new, a more novel intervention. Well, we don't have as much research on it. So our probability of actually achieving this estimate of a 65% increase in good or benefit over 10 years, we're less than 50-50. It's iffy. In a sense, we would have 65% probability that this is not going to happen. We have 45% that it is. So we have more uncertainty rather than certainty about this benefit turning out the way we've estimated. Well, then we have a 75% certainty of that burden showing up. So we have more probability that the bad's going to happen than we have probability that the good's going to happen in this case. But maybe all isn't lost. Maybe the benefit still outweighs the burden. So we do the math. In fact, it does. It decreased though. Once we added in the probabilities, so this is intervention A, before probabilities were dumped in there, but, our actual statistics, we end up with a 1.86 to 1. After probabilities, it's gone down to a 1.1 to 1. This is not nearly as appealing. Just keep that in mind. I mean, it's more benefit than burden. But it's almost 1-to-1. Like for every burden in, I just get one benefit out. Well, that means they'll cancel. That's neutral. It's getting closer to being neutral after those probabilities have been thrown in there. Well, what about intervention B? Remember, it came out, it looked real bad, But let's look. What happens if we add in our probabilities? Well, we said that we had like a 35% probability, or we said that a 35% increase in benefit over 35 years. Well, say that we're over 50%, certain that's going to happen, that we have, more than a 50-50, understanding based off of historical research about this intervention, how it tends to play out in the human population. So we have a 55% probability that this benefit is going to play out the way we expect it to or have estimated it to. Well, in terms of the cost, the burden, well, remember, we were 75%, this was a 75% burden over 35 years. But how certain are we that that's actually the way things are going to play out? Well, not certain at all. A 10% probability that this intervention is actually going to cause a 75% burden over 35 years. That means we're almost 90% certain, or it's 90% more probable that that person's not going to experience a 75% decline in 35 years. So that means it's very unlikely that this is going to be as high as we have estimated it. This means that it is sort of likely that it's going to be beneficial the way we estimate. Remember, it's only 55% probable, but that's better than 50-50. And so now we run those numbers, and what happens? Whoa, look at that. Well, now the benefit is 2.57 to 1 burden on the original that looked terrible. What is making the drastic, I mean, this was like an obvious more burden than benefit before we added in probabilities. We were like, this looks terrible. But then as soon as we add in the probability, everything changes. Now intervention B looks way better than intervention A. And it's all due to the probabilities. And the reason for that is that this is a tremendous burden, but it's so unlikely to happen. We're only taking 10%. Like if you just think about this in terms of math, that first of all, when you multiply 35 by 0.75, that's going to give you 3/4 of 35. So 75% of 35 is going to be what? 30, 28, 29, 30, something like that. Well, somewhere in there. I could do it, but I don't have the calculator right in front of me. But you're not going to get the whole 35. So say that it comes out to be 28. Well, then you're multiplying 28 by 0.1. Well, that's going to be 2.8. That's the low number. Well, up here, you're going to get 35% of 35, which is going to be less than 75 for sure. We're looking at about 10 here. And then, but it's 10 times this number, this high, over 50%. So it's going to be above 5. That number is going to be. Well, yeah, here it is. It's 6.7 and 2.6. See, my estimate wasn't too far off. I said 28. It says 26. Okay, so in my head, not too bad. And then that just turns into a fraction where 2 into 6. Well, that's 3, but then we have some change over here after the decimal, so that's how we get that 2.57. What is happening is this denominator, whenever it gets smaller, and the numerator is like bumped a little bit, it's not going to change a whole lot as long as this is above 50%. And this is drastically unlikely. You're making this denominator small, your numerator's big. That means you're going to get some positive number out of it. That's just the way the math's going to work. So the message, though, is that those probabilities can make a tremendous difference in benefit and burden ratio, and in turn in the decision and recommendation that a doctor should make. That's the key to all this. That medical people or scientists or business people, they should make decisions that have more benefit than risk, more benefit than burden. That's the sort of, underlying assumption behind it. I mean, we do benefit risk analyses because we want more good than we want bad. And so if you're a medical doctor, you would never recommend an intervention or a treatment that if once the math is done, the probabilities are tallied, everything's done in the long run, you would never want to suggest an intervention that has a lower benefit to burden ratio. Like this has a higher benefit to burden ratio. This has a lesser benefit to burden ratio. So if I was picking between these two things and I was a medical doctor, I would have to pick this one. In terms of what should I recommend. Now, if I was just following the numbers, following the analysis. And the idea, though, is that everything that could have gone wrong with just a plain old benefit burden thing still applies right here. Like, how did we get this quality number? How did we get the burden number? How good was the data collection, the bias removed from all this stuff? How good was our sampling? How good why do we think 35 years? Where did those numbers come from? As well as these probabilities. What is our confidence intervals? What are our margin of error? What is it for all these things? That we've got to know. This is the top layer. If we don't know those things about this data, we can't be sure that our ratio is right. Or we can't have the level of confidence that we do often want when we make decisions, medical, business, etc. Now, so what do we do? Well, now that we kind of have a sense We know a significant. People now probably know more about this than they ever wanted to know. I understand hearing someone talk through math looking stuff can be not so enjoyable. Some people like this stuff, some people don't. But the main thing is to just have a sense that these numbers do matter when we're talking about benefit and risk. And even more, what matters the most is how these numbers were generated. I've just done examples assuming we can generate these numbers. But if you're doing it in the real world, these numbers, you have to have data to back these numbers up. And anything bad, bad data collection or inappropriate sampling technique, any of that can result in numbers here that are not accurate. And if any number in this calculation, like, here's a way to think about it. Say that there's some problem in the way my data was collected that I used to develop this probability. Say that this probability is actually should be around 25% rather than 55%, and say that this should actually be 40% rather than 10. Well, anybody can immediately see that's going to make a pretty big change to all this, and intervention B may not be what we want to do. So how we get these numbers matters. That being said, let's move on. Quality of life.